joined today for this last segment by Matt Kittle. Matt Kittle is the executive director of Empower Wisconsin. And Matt, you've been a journalist since you're about 15 years old. Many of your articles appear under the pseudonym MD Kittle. And so you've had a long career doing this, and you're the one, and I'm really grateful to you, who saw what was going on at the Advanced Titan, recognized what we were doing, and that then wrote an article on my experiences, wrote an article about what's happening there. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, talk a little bit about researching a story like this. I guess you're not surprised that even campus newspapers will engage in this kind of shoddy practices.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think some of the comments show that on the story. I think they're dead on, that unfortunately we're seeing too much of this kind of training, this manipulation of news or the narrative, and hence that's why we have the state of journalism, unfortunately, in too many places today. It's CNN and Washington Post and MSNBC, all of those sorts of things, particularly places that are supposed to be right and training grounds that are supposed to be unbiased, nonpartisan, totally objective. The story that was written about you and your class based on the interviews, multiple interviews we've done with people who know you, who took the class, were there at the time in question, certainly don't coincide with the narrative, the headline about hate speech or a misunderstanding, as the headline stated.
Yeah, and the thing that gets me about this, and I made this point in the show a little bit earlier before we brought you on, it's difficult for me to blame the students too much. Their attitude has been abysmal. The fact that I've handed both the student who wrote the story and his student editor all of this information and explained it to them. I made it clear, I'm not looking for you guys to exonerate me. I don't expect you to take my side. But you certainly have to recognize that this is not a he said, she said. It's a he said, a she said versus 13 or 14 other people said, and they couldn't even account for that. And why is it, Matt, when journalists these days, they get really angry, don't they, journalists, when you use the word fake news, and they get really angry when you won't talk to them in many instances. They sense when you won't talk to them that you're hiding something. So how come in a situation like this, they're proud of this? I mean, the student editor over the student reporter, when I wrote him about my dissatisfaction with this, he said, I think the story was well written. Right? So there you go. So why won't they talk to you if they feel that way? And why won't their professors at the university who oversee the Advanced Titan newspaper, why would none of them talk to you?
Well, it's interesting, and I've been in this business long enough to know that if you are over the target, you're bound to take a lot more heat, aren't you? And that's exactly what happened here. Now, the university, like a lot of universities, will write this off as a personnel matter. And that's the overarching theme of a lot of universities that could find themselves in a liability issue. I'm not saying that's the case here. I'm just saying that's my experience. As far as the student goes, the newspaper, the editor, and the people who oversee that student newspaper, the fact that they didn't want to stand by their story or at least even offer a comment on it is concerning, to say the least, because they put a lot of time and effort in this story. They certainly put some time in the headline of that story. Where they didn't seem to put the time is corroborating with a number of students who were in your class and other things on the record. And that's unfortunate all around.
It is, especially when you consider the fact that not only did I hand both of them, I emailed the managing editor, I handed the student reporter all those documents. I actually emailed his student boss all those documents. Not a word, not even a comment on those things. And so let me ask you to just imagine with me for a second. So we have a situation like you described here. What do you have to be thinking when you know that there is exculpatory information that, you know it's there. You know that the very day I gave him the student reporter this information, I said to him, Joe, I can get you interviews on the phone today. I've got a number of these kids who are eager to talk. What I can't get around is how they're willing to, it's not really even about me. Why are you willing to silence the voice of 12, 13, 15 other students who saw something completely different and put your full faith and force in one student complainer? How do you square that circle if you're a progressive journalist?
Because you're a progressive journalist. It doesn't fit the narrative, right? The story is what it is. Listen, I hope that the journalist went into the story just as any investigation, and I think attorneys will say the same thing. You go into it, you have some idea of what's going on, but the field is open, it's wide open, and that's why you ask questions. And there's a natural curiosity that should be there. If a dozen students in a class that took that class have a different one individual who complained, and we know that that individual missed a majority of your classes based on the record, well, you probably should talk to those folks at the very least. And after you talk to them, as I did and my colleague, Josh Waldock did, we started to see a pattern there. And that pattern is very important in terms of corroboration or negating a lot of things that may have been said in that complaint. Here's another problem, and you probably already touched upon this. You know this as the individual who was the subject of that investigation. You are not exonerated in that story until the last two graphs of it. That's very problematic.
Right. They wait till the very end after they do a pretty good job of suggesting that I'm full of it, right? I mean, why would any student make this up, right? If we've just got the professor and this one student, what would be in it for her for making this up, right? Ignoring all the other kids. And at the very end, they point out, almost grudgingly, oh, and by the way, Pesta was never found guilty of any of this, right? And so from the beginning, and that's my kind of my last observation I want you to comment on here, is how does somebody like me, setting aside my personal revulsion for being at the center of this and for having this done, right? I thought I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. I put them in touch with people who could give them an alternative narrative. They were not interested. They're still not interested. What gets me, though, is that at some level, don't they have to know, and don't their student advisors have to know, the professors, that this is creating a narrative. It's not reporting on one. I believe this. 20 years ago, you may have been the most liberal professor overseeing a group of kids, student journalists, but you still would not have let this fly. You would not let a story like this fly because it is so obviously flawed that you didn't bother to do your due diligence. Is this the brave new world, even when we're teaching kids on college campuses to be journalists now, that you can actually avoid and ignore evidence that makes the wrong political point?
Yes, it is, Aldous Huxley. Yes, it is. I'm afraid that's the short answer to the question. I mean, I have been in the newspaper business, online journalism, and radio broadcasting, reporting and radio broadcasting for 30 years. It's amazing just to say that out loud. Knowing it is enough. And yes, I have had managing editors and city editors who would have read me the riot act, and did when I made mistakes, when I didn't ask the next follow-up question, the logical question. You're going to miss some things. Everybody does in reporting. That's fine. But when you start off with the premise, and when you follow that premise all the way through without questioning, and only trying to build off of what your narrative is, then you have pretty much abdicated your responsibility as a journalist. And kids in school, young people in school, have to learn that lesson. Unfortunately, they're learning the opposite lesson, as you said, and the evidence is in what we're reading. And so often we don't see the other point of view. And too often that other point of view is the conservative side, or the side that doesn't always fit the afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted narrative of the left.
Well, I mean, it's been a sobering experience for me, and I don't think it's done yet. Rather than talk to you, the student journalists, rather than their faculty enablers talking to you, they're doing more open records requests on me. So what their target here is to go take this further now. So looking forward to that. Your article, I'm grateful for it. Thanks for writing it. This is Empower Wisconsin. Check it out. And it's already been picked up, this article, by Town Hall. And I think there may be others down the road who'll pick it up as well. So thank you for being an actual journalist and for taking on this story. So the moral of the story, kids, first of all, I want to thank you for being with me. This is not a usual story. It's a very personal story. It's a very recent story. But I think it's really good for you to know how universities go about doing what they do. How universities and their adjuncts, these almost exclusively liberal on-campus news sites go about skewing and fishing and misrepresenting stories. It's a shame. There's so few conservatives on college campuses that this is what goes on with them. I maintain what I said before, that if this were a very conservative kid who was filed a complaint against a very liberal professor, this wouldn't even have made the news at the Advanced Titan. And if it did, it most certainly wouldn't be handled the way that it was. The big takeaway from me is now you have a better sense why journalism has become corrupted, why journalism is viewed almost lower than even Congress in terms of the approval of the American people. Because it is a sacred thing, it's a First Amendment sacred thing, to have a press whose job it is to get to the truth. And as we see at the Advanced Titan, the purpose is not the truth. The purpose is not to find out what happened and then to go for and let the reader decide. The purpose of what the Advanced Titan did, and may still yet do again in another story down the road, is to convince you of a narrative they have in mind. And that narrative is that any professor who's not a liberal, any professor who engages in speech or teaches books or approaches texts from a conservative or Christian or traditional background has to be a troublemaker, has to be offending kids. The student journalists can't get beyond that, and it's a shame that their enablers at the professorial level seem to be okay with these kind of smears as well. Thanks for joining today.